They almost made it home. 4 hours. That was what the scientists had promised. 4 hours before the window closed permanently and the membrane between worlds sealed itself like a wound. They didn't get 4 hours. They got 4 seconds. One moment the convergence point was there, visible even to eyes that couldn't see the force. A shimmer in the air like heat rising from summer asphalt. The unmistakable outline of a door standing open in the middle of nothing. Authur had seen it. John had seen it. Their horses had shied from it with the deep animal intelligence that knows when something is wrong about the world. And then it was gone, not fading, not closing gradually. Gone, like a lamp extinguished, like a word swallowed mid-sentence, like something that had never intended to stay open in the first place. Stranded in a galaxy at war, with no way home and no explanation, except that explanations, it turned out, existed. They had existed for a very long time. In archives and prophecy fragments and the careful records of people who had known something was coming and had written it down and hoped someone would find it before it was too late. Someone had found it. The question was whether finding it was already too late. Authur heard it go. That was the strangest part. Not seeing it close, not feeling it close, but hearing it. A sound with no acoustic equivalent in any language he had words for. Somewhere between a chord and a silence. The specific resonance of something vast and structural ceasing to exist. It lasted less than a second. It left a ringing in his ears that took 10 minutes to fade, and a hollow feeling in his chest that he suspected was not going to fade at all. He stood where the convergence point had been and looked at the empty air where it wasn't anymore. John was beside him, reins in hand, horse pressed against his shoulder, the way horses press when they are frightened and have decided a human is their best available option. The horse was trembling. John was not trembling, but his jaw was set in the particular way it set when he was managing something large and not yet ready to name it. Neither of them spoke for almost a full minute. Then John said, "It's gone." "Yeah," Authur said. "It's actually gone." "Yeah." Another silence. "Authur," John said carefully, with the tone of a man building toward something he doesn't want to build toward. "If that was the only window, I know. And if the scientists said it was a permanent collapse, John, I'm just establishing what we're dealing with." "I know what we're dealing with." Authur turned away from the empty air, looked at the canyon, at the wrong sky, at the 2 moons that had stopped bothering him somewhere around day 6, and that now felt like a permanent feature of his reality, in a way that was somehow worse than when they'd been alarming. "We're stranded." The word sat between them like a stone. From 11 kilometers away, back at the forward camp, a disturbance moved through the force with enough violence to knock Ahsoka Tano sideways in the middle of a training sequence she'd been running to stay sharp between engagements. As she caught herself on the wall of the training shelter and stood there with one hand braced against the durasteel and felt the ripple pass through her. Not pain, not threat, but significance. The force communicating in the way it communicated when something had shifted in the underlying architecture of things. She straightened, looked in the direction of the convergence point. "Sky Guy," she said into her comm. "Something just happened." Anakin's voice came back immediately, because he had felt it too. "I know, get a gunship." He arrived at the site 12 minutes later. descended from the gunship with Ahsoka beside him, and walked to where Authur and John stood in the empty canyon with their horses and their permanent expressions and the particular quality of stillness that he had come to recognize as what these two men looked like when they were absorbing something catastrophic without letting it take them apart. He looked at the empty air where the convergence point had been. He reached out through the Force, found nothing, not the absence of something that had been removed, but the absolute flat nothing of something that had never existed. Whatever had been there was gone in a way that went beyond closure. It was as though the window had not shut but had been erased. "It didn't just close?" he said. "No," Ahsoka agreed quietly beside him. "Something collapsed it." He looked at her. From the outside, Ahsoka met his eyes. Neither of them said the thing they were both thinking, because they had both been in this war long enough to know that some thoughts were safer unspoken until you had evidence to put under them. Authur watched this exchange with the focused attention he brought to conversations where people were saying more than the words they were using. "You think someone closed it," Authur said. Not a question. Anakin looked at him. The calculation behind his eyes was visible for a moment. The assessment of how much to say, how much to withhold. The habitual information management of a general in a war where information was itself a weapon. Then he made the choice that Authur had seen him make before, the one that cost him something every time he made it. He told the truth. "The energy signature of the collapse," Anakin said, "matches Force manipulation. Specific, deliberate, and very powerful." He paused. Someone with considerable ability in the Force closed that window from a distance. John looked at Authur. Authur looked at Anakin. "So we didn't get stranded," Authur said slowly. "We got kept." Anakin held his gaze. "That's one way to frame it. Is there another way?" A long pause. "No," Anakin said. "That's the accurate way." The canyon was very quiet. The front line rumbled in its distant register. Above them, the wrong stars were becoming visible in the early evening sky, indifferent and ancient and arranged in their meaningless patterns. John took his hat off and held it in both hands, looking at the ground, doing the thing he did when he was thinking through something he didn't want to think through. "So somebody brought us here," he said. "And now they've made sure we can't leave." He looked up. "And the only people with that kind of reach are the people running this war," Authur finished. Anakin said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. John put his hat back on. "Well," he said, with the flat, exhausted acceptance of a man who has been in bad situations before and recognizes the specific texture of a bad situation getting worse. "Ain't that something?" Authur looked at the empty air one more time. Then he turned away from it for the last time and looked at Anakin Skywalker with eyes that had already done the grieving and come out the other side. "All right," he said. "Tell us everything you know." The archive record was classified at a level that technically required Senate authorization to access. Anakin accessed it anyway, which surprised nobody who knew him, and which Ahsoka logged in her personal record as standard operating procedure, with the resigned accuracy of someone who has stopped filing objections to things that are going to happen regardless of objections. The Jedi Temple's restricted archive maintained a satellite node aboard the lead cruiser, a precaution implemented after the Battle of Geonosis. when the Council had recognized that field commanders needed access to sensitive records without the 3-day communication lag that temple requests required in active combat zones. Now, it was a practical solution that had the secondary effect of making it significantly easier for a general with a history of doing what he believed was necessary to do what he believed was necessary. Anakin pulled the record in the early hours, alone in the command shelter with the tactical displays dimmed and the camp quiet around him. He searched first under dimensional anomalies, found 14 classified entries ranging from credible to obviously fabricated, dismissed 12 immediately, read the remaining 2 carefully. The second one stopped him. He read it twice. Then he pulled the attached fragment files, 17 of them, each individually sealed, with the kind of encryption that suggested whoever had sealed them had wanted them to require effort to open, not as security but as a filter, ensuring that only someone who genuinely wanted to know would go to the trouble of finding out. He opened all 17. He read through the night. He came to Authur and John at dawn looking like a man who had not slept, which he hadn't, and like a man who had found something he wasn't sure he wanted to have found, which he had. He set a datapad on the field table between them without preamble and stood back with his arms crossed in the way he stood when he was putting distance between himself and information he was delivering. "Read the highlighted sections," he said. Authur picked up the datapad. John leaned in beside him. The record was old. The dating at the header read 11,000 years before the current calendar, which meant nothing to Authur in terms of cultural reference, but communicated age in a way that even a man from the American frontier could register. The language had been translated 3 times across 11 millennia and carried the particular quality of very old things rendered in modern terms. Slightly formal, slightly wrong, like a portrait painted from a description rather than from life. Authur read, "And in the time of the galaxy's greatest unmaking, when the darkness wears the face of order, and the servants of the light cannot see the hand that moves against them, the force will reach beyond its own boundary." He read it again. "Two who are outside the current, neither sensitive nor blind, carrying the weight of their own undoing as armor against corruption. For what has already broken cannot be broken again in the same place, will be drawn through the membrane between what is and what might be." John was very still beside him. Authur kept reading. "They will not come as saviors. They will not come with power that overwhelms. They will come as witnesses, as mirrors, as the thing that stands beside the one who is falling and says, 'I see you. I have been where you are standing. The choice you are about to make is not the only choice available." Authur set the datapad down. The camp was waking up around them, the sounds of the 501st beginning its morning routines, the smell of whatever passed for calf in the Republic military, the distant early percussion of the front line that had become as familiar as birdsong. 11,000 years old, John said. "Yes," Anakin said, "and it's about us." Anakin said nothing, which was confirmation. John looked at Authur. Authur was looking at the datapad with an expression that John recognized. The expression Authur wore when something confirmed a thing he had already quietly suspected and had been hoping would turn out to be wrong. The weight of their own undoing as armor against corruption, Authur said. He looked up at Anakin. That's a specific thing to write about two specific people. Yes, Anakin said. It's talking about our histories, the things we did, the things we carried. Arthur's voice was level and careful. Someone or something 11,000 years ago knew we were coming, knew what we were, and decided that was exactly the qualification needed. Not warriors, John said slowly, working through it. Not force users, not soldiers. Men who had already fallen, Authur said, and gotten back up. The silence held. Anakin unfolded his arms, moved to the field table and sat, which was unusual for him. Anakin conducted difficult conversations standing, using height and movement as tools. Sitting meant something. It meant he was about to say something that required the same ground. There's more, he said. He reached across and scrolled the datapad to a second highlighted section. Authur read it. The one who stands at the edge of the great unmaking will not be a stranger to them. They will know his face, not because they have met him, but because they have stood at the same edge and looked down into the same dark and made a different choice. And in knowing his face, they will know what is still possible. Not salvation. The window for salvation may have already passed, but witness. Truth spoken into the dark by those who have no reason to lie and no stake in the outcome beyond the simple fact of what is right. Authur looked up. At Anakin. Anakin held his gaze with the exhausted steadiness of a man who had read the same passage 6 times in the dark and had arrived at the same conclusion each time and had been sitting with it ever since. The one who stands at the edge of the great unmaking, Authur said quietly. Anakin said nothing. That's you, John said. Not unkindly, just directly, with the blunt clarity that John applied to true things when softening them would cost more than it saved. Anakin looked at the table. The Council doesn't know this record exists, he said. Or if they know it exists, they don't know what it says. The encryption was... He paused. It was placed by a single archivist 12 years ago, someone who found the original fragment and understood what it meant and sealed it because they were afraid of what would happen if the wrong people read it. Who was the archivist? Ahsoka asked. She had been standing at the shelter entrance, present and quiet, having arrived somewhere in the middle of the reading. Anakin looked at her. Jocasta knew, he said. She sealed it 12 years ago, 2 weeks after she had a private meeting with the Chancellor. The name meant nothing to Authur, but the sequence. Archivist finds ancient record. Archivist meets Chancellor. Archivist seals record immediately after. Had a shape he recognized from a world that operated on the same fundamental principles regardless of the galaxy it occupied. Someone had already known, had already read it, had already decided what to do with it. Palpatine, Authur said. It wasn't a question. Anakin's mechanical hand made the faint rhythmic sound against the table edge, fingers moving without his apparent awareness. The tell that Authur had identified on day 3 and filed carefully. He knew we were coming before we arrived, John said. Didn't he? I think, Anakin said, with the precise, careful delivery of a man choosing words, the way a man crossing ice chooses steps, that the Chancellor knows a great many things that he has not shared with the Senate or the Council. He looked up. And I think the intermediary who tried to have you killed was not acting to eliminate a threat. Authur looked at him. He was acting to prevent a conversation, Anakin said. Specifically. His jaw tightened. This one. The intercepted transmission arrived at 0900. It came through a captured Separatist comm relay that the 501st Slicer unit had been running as a passive intelligence feed for 3 weeks. A wire, essentially, tapped into a frequency that moved low-level Separatist coordination traffic, and occasionally, when the operational security on the other end got lazy or rushed, something more interesting. The Slicer, a trooper called Patch who had developed an instinct for signals intelligence that his growth acceleration hadn't diminished and his training hadn't fully explained, flagged it within 4 minutes of receipt and had it on Anakin's datapad within 8. Anakin read it again, handed it to Ahsoka without a word. Ahsoka read it and went very still in the way she went still when something required her full processing capacity, and she had learned, unlike her master, to stop moving when that was happening. She handed it to Authur. The transmission was short, 14 lines, formatted in the clipped bureaucratic language of official Republic correspondence, which made the content more disturbing rather than less. The way a formal voice delivering terrible news makes the news feel more real rather than more distant. Asset confirmation. Dimensional anomaly subjects have not been neutralized. Convergence point successfully collapsed per instruction. Subjects remain in theater. First and second elimination teams compromised. Vex in Republic custody. Acceptable loss. He knows nothing of operational origin. Primary directive stands. Subjects must not be permitted extended contact with Skywalker. The longer they remain in proximity, the higher the probability of the Varith condition being fulfilled. Authorization has been given for escalation to Tier 4 asset deployment. Coruscant sends regards. Authur read it twice, looked at the signature block at the bottom. Not a name, a designation, a 4-character code that meant nothing to him. Varith condition, he said. The prophecy fragment, Anakin said. Varith was the archivist who originally recorded it, 11,000 years ago. He was standing at the tactical display with his back partially to the room, which Authur had come to understand was what Anakin did when he was managing something he didn't want visible on his face. Someone named the scenario after him. You turned it into an operational term. Palpatine's people named it, John said. Yes, which means they've been planning around it, around us. John looked at Authur. They didn't just know we were coming. They built contingencies. Tier 4 asset, Ahsoka said. She looked at Anakin's back. Sky Guy. What's a Tier 4 asset? Anakin turned from the display. His expression was the controlled version, the general's face, the public face, the one that communicated assessment rather than feeling. Authur had learned to look underneath it. Underneath it was something that lived close to fear. In Republic intelligence classification, Anakin said carefully, Tier 4 denotes resources that are not officially acknowledged to exist, assets that operate entirely outside the chain of command. No Senate oversight. No Jedi Council awareness. He paused. Resources that the Chancellor's office maintains for situations where standard options have failed, and the priority is absolute. Meaning they'll send someone we can't trace back to anyone, John said. meaning they'll send someone whose existence will be denied by every level of the Republic government if they're caught or killed. Anakin looked at Authur directly, meaning whoever comes next will not be an assassin or a dark side operative with an agenda of his own. It will be something purpose-built for this specific problem. Authur absorbed this with the stillness that John had stopped finding unnerving years ago and had started finding reassuring. The stillness meant Authur was working, not frozen. "How long do we have?" Authur asked. "On transmission was sent 14 hours ago." Patch's voice came through the sheltercom. "Fastest Tier 4 deployment from Coruscant to this theater, based on what I can find in the traffic patterns, is 30 to 40 hours. Authur looked at John. 30 hours, John said. "Give or take," Authur said. "So we got a day and some change before something we can't identify shows up to kill us in a way nobody will admit to. That's about it." John considered this for a moment with the same flat equanimity he had brought to every escalation since their arrival, which Authur privately found one of the more admirable things about him. "All right," John said, "what do we do?" What they did in the first hour was argue. Not Authur and John. They had long since developed the efficiency of people who had resolved their fundamental disagreements years ago, and now only fought about tactics. The argument was between Anakin and Ahsoka, conducted in the clipped, urgent shorthand of people who were very close and very opposed, standing at opposite ends of the command shelter while Authur and John sat at the field table and observed with the careful neutrality of men attending someone else's family dispute. Ahsoka's position was that they needed to bring this to the Council immediately. The intercepted transmission, the prophecy fragment, the clear implication of Chancellor's office involvement in what amounted to targeted assassination inside a Republic military installation. Anakin's position was that they couldn't. "Why not?" Ahsoka said for the second time, but with the controlled patience of someone who had not found the first answer sufficient. "Because we don't know who on the Council has already seen that archive record," Anakin said. "We don't know who Palpatine has spoken to. We don't know who knows about the Varith condition and has already decided which side of it they're on." "You're saying we can't trust the Council?" "I'm saying we can't trust all of them, and we don't know which ones." Ahsoka looked at him for a long moment. "That's not a reason, that's a fear." Anakin's jaw tightened. "It's a tactical assessment." "It's both," Authur said from the field table. Both Jedi looked at him. Authur kept his voice level and his eyes on the middle distance. The way he spoke when he was saying something that needed to land without the weight of eye contact making it defensive. "No, it's a legitimate tactical assessment, and it's also fear," he said. "Those things can both be true at the same time. Usually are." He looked at his hands. "The question isn't which one it is. The question is whether the fear is pointing at something real or pointing at something you put there yourself." The shelter was quiet. Ahsoka looked at Anakin. Anakin looked at Authur with an expression that cycled through several things quickly: resistance, recognition, the particular exhaustion of a man encountering an accurate statement he had been successfully avoiding. "There's a Jedi Master I trust," he said finally, completely, without question. "Obi-Wan?" Ahsoka said immediately. "Yes." "Then we contact Obi-Wan," she said. "We show him everything. We let him make the call about the council." Anakin was quiet for a long moment. "He'll want to bring it forward," Anakin said. "He'll want to do this properly, through channels." "Maybe that's right," Ahsoka said. "Maybe it gets Authur and John killed while the council deliberates. Maybe keeping it to ourselves gets them killed anyway and takes half the 500 first with them." Ahsoka held his gaze steadily. "Anakin, we cannot fight a Tier 4 deployment alone. We don't even know what it is. We need help." Another long silence. Authur watched Anakin work through it. The visible internal negotiation of a man who had spent years substituting his own judgment for institutional trust because the institution had failed him in ways he'd never fully articulated, and the substitution had become habit, load-bearing, structural. He recognized it because he had done the same thing for years with Dutch's gang and called it loyalty. "Contact Kenobi," Authur said quietly. Anakin looked at him. "You trust him," Authur said. "That's not nothing. In my experience, that's most of it." He held Anakin's gaze. "Trust the thing you actually trust. Stop managing around it." Something in Anakin's face shifted. Not dramatically, not the cinematic collapse of a long-held position, but the small, specific movement of a man who has been given permission to do what he already knew was right. He reached for the comm. Obi-Wan Kenobi answered on the third ping. His holographic image materialized above the projector in the familiar blue-white light that made everyone look like a ghost of themselves, which Authur had decided was either an engineering oversight or a design choice that said something unflattering about whoever had designed it. Kenobi looked tired in the way of men who have been tired for so long it had become their default expression, a distinguished tiredness, worn with the particular grace of someone who had decided that if exhaustion was going to be permanent, it might as well be dignified. He took in the shelter, Anakin, Ahsoka, Authur and John at the field table, the tactical displays, the general quality of tension in the room that was thick enough to have its own weather. "This looks serious," he said. "It is," Anakin said. "You're not going to tell me you've done something I need to fix, are you? Because I've had a rather full week already." "I haven't done anything," Anakin said. Kenobi's expression suggested he was reserving judgment on that. Anakin transmitted the archive record, the intercepted transmission, and Patch's traffic analysis in a single compressed package. Kenobi received it, looked down at whatever display he was reading from off hologram, and was quiet for a long time. Authur watched the holographic face while it read, watched the precise, controlled reactions of a man who had trained himself to manage his responses and was currently managing something that required significant management. A small tension around the eyes, a barely perceptible stillness of the jaw. "The Varith fragment," Kenobi said finally. "You know it," Anakin said. "Not a question. I know of it. It's referenced in secondary literature as apocryphal. Most scholars dismissed it as a post-Rusin interpolation with no original source document." He paused. Apparently, the original source document existed and was simply very well hidden. He looked up into the hologram field toward Anakin. "Jocasta sealed this 12 years ago." 2 weeks after meeting with Palpatine, Anakin said. Kenobi was quiet again. "Say what you're thinking," Anakin said. "I'm thinking several things simultaneously," and I'm choosing the order carefully," Kenobi said, with the measured delivery that Authur had come to understand was what precision sounded like on a man who had made it a practice. He looked toward Authur and John. "You two are the subjects of the fragment." "Appears so," Authur said. How are you finding that?" Authur looked at him steadily. "About as well as you'd expect." Something shifted in Kenobi's expression, not quite a smile, but the ancestor of one. He looked back at Anakin. "The Tier 4 designation. I've heard that term once before, 2 years ago, in a conversation I wasn't meant to be part of. A Senate Intelligence Subcommittee closed session. The term was used in reference to a program that officially does not exist within any Republic budget line." He paused. It was referred to as the Null Directive. "What is it?" Ahsoka asked. "Individuals recruited, that's the generous term, from Separatist prisoner populations. Force sensitives who were captured, not killed, and subjected to a conditioning process that the official record doesn't describe in any detail worth trusting." Kenobi's voice remained level, which cost something. Authur could see it cost something. They operate without identity, without history, without the psychological architecture that makes a person reluctant to kill. He looked at Anakin. They are, in the most precise sense, weapons. Not soldiers, not assassins. Weapons. The shelter was very quiet. "A conditioned force sensitive," Ahsoka said slowly, "coming here. Within 30 hours, John said. Give or take." Kenobi looked at Authur and John for a long moment. "The fragment says you're here as witnesses, as mirrors." He seemed to be working something out in real time. "A conditioned force sensitive would have no capacity to receive that. No psychological surface for it to land on. That's the point of the conditioning." He looked at Anakin. "They're not sending this to kill Authur and John because they're a physical threat. They're sending it because a weapon can't have a conversation," Anakin said. "Because a weapon can't be reached," Kenobi said. "And if the Varith condition is real, if these two men are here to serve the function the fragment describes, then the one thing Palpatine cannot allow is for them to be present and functional long enough to fulfill it." He paused. "He doesn't want them dead because they're dangerous to his army. He wants them dead because they're dangerous to him. Specifically." Authur looked at John. John looked at the table. "We're dangerous to the most powerful man in the Republic," John said. Because we can hold up a mirror." "That's what the fragment says," Kenobi said. "That's a hell of a thing to be killed over," John said. "Being honest." "Men have been killed for less," Authur said quietly. Kenobi straightened. His decision-making was visible in the way Anakin's rarely was. Where Anakin decided from the gut and justified upward, Kenobi assembled the logic first and followed it, and you could see the assembly happening in real time if you watched carefully. "I'm not bringing this to the full council," he said. Anakin blinked. "You're not?" "Not yet. Not until we understand the extent of the penetration." He looked at Anakin steadily. "You were right to be cautious. I'm not going to tell you that you were wrong to trust your instinct on that, because you weren't." A pause waited. "You're not always wrong, Anakin. I should say that more." Something moved through Anakin's face, fast, unguarded, the specific expression of a person receiving something they needed and had stopped expecting. Authur looked away from it. Some things deserved privacy, even from witnesses. "What do we do about the weapon they're sending?" Ahsoka asked. "We can't fight something we can't identify," Kenobi said, "and a conditioned operative will not arrive in any form that announces itself." He looked at Authur. "The fragment says you're here as mirrors, as the thing that stands beside the one who is falling and says, 'I see you.'" He paused. "In my experience, the most effective defense against a weapon is removing the reason it was deployed. If the Varith condition is fulfilled before it arrives, it has no mission." "You're saying we should have the conversation," Authur said, "the one Palpatine is trying to prevent." "I'm saying the fragment doesn't describe a battle," Kenobi said. "It describes a moment of recognition between specific people, and the window for that moment is apparently now." His holographic eyes moved to Anakin. "I'm saying that what needs to happen in the next 30 hours probably doesn't require my presence or the Council's authorization or a tactical plan." He held Anakin's gaze with the quiet directness of a man who had known someone for a very long time and had earned the right to be direct with them. "I think you know what it requires." Anakin said nothing. "I'll come to Christophsis," Kenobi said. "I'll be there in 20 hours, whatever happens before I arrive." He looked between Anakin and Authur. "I trust the people in that room to handle it." The hologram went dark. The shelter was quiet for a long moment. Then John stood up, stretched, picked up his hat from the table and settled it on his head. "Reckon I'll go check the perimeter," he said. He looked at Authur, then at Anakin, back at Authur, with the specific look that meant, "I'm leaving you two alone because this is the conversation, and we both know it, and one of us needs to not be here for it." He walked out. Ahsoka looked at Anakin, then at Authur, then at the shelter entrance. "I'll help with the perimeter," she said, and followed John. Authur looked at the empty doorway for a moment. Then he looked at Anakin Skywalker, who was standing at the tactical display with his back to the room and his mechanical hand against his vambrace, and something in the set of his shoulders that was very close to the thing Authur had seen in his own reflection for years before he'd learned what it was. "Sit down," Authur said quietly. After a moment, Anakin sat. The conversation started the way honest conversations usually start, with a long silence. Authur didn't rush it. He had learned years ago that silence was not the enemy of truth. It was the room truth needed to move into before it could be spoken. Men who filled silence immediately were men who were afraid of what would come out of it. He sat across the field table from Anakin Skywalker and let the quiet exist between them without apology until the quality of it changed from uncomfortable to something else, something that was almost ready. "I'm not going to ask you to tell me things you don't want to tell me," Authur said finally. "That ain't what this is." Anakin looked at the table. "Then what is it?" "I'm going to tell you some things about myself," Authur said, "and you're going to listen. And if any of it means something to you, that's between you and whatever you carry." He paused. "That's all." Anakin was still. "Go ahead," he said. Authur looked at his hands. The gun hand, the left hand, the hands that had done the things they had done across a life that had been one thing and then another and then something else entirely. He had not talked about himself plainly and without management in a long time. Not to John. John knew it all already, had been present for most of it. Not to anyone, really. The habit of concealment was old and deep, but old habits, he had learned, were not permanent features. They were just decisions that had been made so many times they had started to feel like facts. I rode with a gang for most of my life, he said. Robbed people, hurt people, told myself it was necessary. Told myself the men I rode with were family and that family justified the means. He kept his voice even, neither confessional nor defensive, just factual. Told myself the man who led us was right, even when he wasn't. Especially when he wasn't, because by then I'd put so much of myself into believing in him that stopping meant admitting what I'd spent. Anakin said nothing. He changed, Authur said. Or maybe he didn't change. Maybe we just got to the place where who he actually was became visible, where the distance between who I needed him to be and who he actually was got too wide to stand in. He paused. I kept standing in it anyway, for too long, because leaving meant grief, and grief meant loss, and loss meant admitting that the thing I'd built my life around was built wrong. The camp moved quietly outside the shelter. The front line rumbled in its permanent low register. By the time I admitted it, Authur said, I was dying, had a sickness, and I thought, this is what I deserve. This is the bill coming due. He looked at the table. Spent some time in that place. It's a dark place. You can convince yourself of things in it that aren't true. You can convince yourself the darkness is the accurate version of reality and everything else is the lie. How did you get out of it? Anakin said. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual controlled quality, something underneath coming through. Authur considered the question honestly. Man I respected told me it wasn't about deserving, he said. Said we get to decide who we are right up until the end. That it's not about what you've done, it's about what you do with what's left. He paused. I didn't believe him right away. Took time, but I started making different choices. Small ones first, then bigger ones. Not because I thought they'd save me or fix what I'd done. Just because they were right. He looked up at Anakin. And it turned out doing right when it didn't benefit you, when there was no angle in it, when nobody was watching and there was no reward. That was the only thing that actually felt like breathing again. Anakin's jaw moved. What if the wrong choices are already made? He said. What if you're already past the point where small right choices can... He stopped. Can what? Authur said. Can matter. The word came out rough, stripped of its casing. What if the thing you've already set in motion is too large? What if the people you've already hurt can't be... He stopped again. Unhurt, Authur said. Yes. Authur nodded slowly. That's the real weight, ain't it? Not the guilt, the math. The idea that the debt is too large to ever balance, and so the trying is pointless, and so you might as well stop trying and just carry it. Just be the person who carries it and doesn't pretend otherwise. Anakin looked at him with eyes that were exhausted in a very specific way. The exhaustion of a man who has been seen accurately and doesn't have the energy left to perform not being seen. Yeah, he said. That's it. I lived in that place for a long time, Authur said. I know every corner of it. He held Anakin's gaze. The math isn't real. You're doing the math wrong. How? Because you're calculating what you owe against what you've done, Authur said. And you'll never balance that. No man can. The debt to the people you've hurt is permanent. You carry that. That's right and true, and you should carry it. But that ain't the same as saying the future is already written. He paused. The future is just choices, one after another, and the next one is still yours. Anakin was very still. There's someone, he said finally, in a voice that was nearly nothing. Someone I love, someone I would... He couldn't finish it. I know, Authur said quietly. You don't know what I know the shape of it, Authur said. A man who loves someone so much, he'd burn the world to keep them. I've seen it. I've seen what it does. He kept his voice without judgment, without the hardness that would have made it easier to deflect. That love is real. Don't let anybody tell you it ain't. But love that becomes a reason to do harm isn't love protecting someone. It's fear wearing love's clothes. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Outside, somewhere in the camp, a trooper laughed at something. The ordinary sound of it moved through the shelter like light through a gap. Anakin put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands for a long moment. Not breaking. Authur had seen men break, knew the sound of it. This was different. This was a man putting down something heavy for the first time in a long time. Just for a moment, just to feel what it weighed. When he looked up, his eyes were clear in a way they hadn't been since Authur had arrived. The prophecy says you're here as a witness, Anakin said. Yeah, Authur said, not to save me. No, Authur said, I can't save you. That ain't mine to do. He met his gaze directly. But I've stood where you're standing, and I'm telling you, as a man who has no reason to lie to you and nothing to gain from it, that the edge you're standing at is not the only place left to stand. Anakin looked at him for a long moment. Then something happened in his face that Authur did not have a name for but recognized. The specific expression of a man who has been carrying something alone for so long that the simple fact of not being alone with it, even for a moment, even briefly, had changed the weight of it without changing the thing itself. Thank you, Anakin said, quietly, plainly, without the general's voice or the performance of composure. Authur nodded once. He stood, picked up his hat, moved toward the shelter entrance and stopped, because there was one more thing, and the one more thing was true, and true things deserved to be said. The people standing beside you, Authur said, without turning around. Kenobi, your apprentice. He paused. They see you, the real version, not the general. He put his hat on. Don't make them carry the grief of losing you to something that ain't worth losing you to. He walked out into the morning light. Behind him, Anakin Skywalker sat at the field table alone in the quiet shelter and looked at his hands, the flesh hand and the mechanical hand, and breathed. Just breathed, for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember. Just breathed. 30 hours away, something with no name and no history was moving through hyperspace toward Christophsis. But in the shelter, in the quiet, in the breathing, something else was moving too. Something older than the Republic and quieter than the Force and more stubborn than either. The particular small persistent light of a man deciding one more time who he still had the chance to be. The conversation happened. The one Palpatine had spent resources and assets and careful architecture trying to prevent. It happened anyway. in a field shelter on a contested world, between a dying general and two outlaws from another universe, the thing the Chancellor feared most had simply occurred, because truth doesn't require permission, and mirrors don't need authorization to show you your own face. But the null directive is still coming, something with no name, no history, and no capacity for the conversation that just changed everything, is moving through hyperspace toward Christophsis. And when it arrives, it won't care what was said in that shelter. It won't be reachable. It won't be reasoned with. It will just be the next thing trying to make sure none of this mattered. Obi-Wan Kenobi is 20 hours out. The weapon is 30. And Authur, Morgan and John Marston, two men who were brought here for a reason, who have now fulfilled the purpose written for them 11,000 years before they were born, must decide whether their part in this story is finished, or whether it's only just begun.